So Betty Martin was, she was a young debutante who lived here in New Orleans. She had this wonderful life, kind of a charmed life. She was a beautiful, lovely young woman. And when she was, and Elizabeth, who is the curator, can correct me if I make mistakes because I can't remember everything. But I think when she was about 19 years old, she saw she had a little red mark on her leg. And she went to a dermatologist eventually, and the dermatologist diagnosed her with leprosy. And her family said, the doctor said, you really need to go to Carville to be treated. And she had a lot of younger siblings. They didn't want her around. And by the way, I should start this out with, it turns out that leprosy is actually one of the least contagious diseases there is. So all of this was based on the stigma, fear, ignorance about the disease. Betty was eventually, she was brought, this was in, I think, 1929, 1930. She was brought out to Carville and became a patient there. She thought she was going to get cured immediately and come back and join her family. And she ended up staying there. She left a little bit for a while, but she ended up basically staying there for most of her life and dying there. And while she was there, did you ever meet her husband?
Oh, Harry.
Harry, right. Yeah. So she met a young man there at Carville who also had leprosy and was in a very similar situation as she was. And when you went to Carville, you were not allowed, especially the early days, the sisters would not let the men and women like anywhere near each other. But even the federal government basically kept, the patients, they certainly had separate dorms. And the patients were not allowed to get married. They were not allowed to have children. They lost a lot of their rights when they were sent to Carville, including the right to vote, which is the most astonishing thing to me. But she and Harry fell in love. And like a lot of the people who fell in love there, what they did is they snuck out and they got married. And then some of them snuck back in because in many ways, Carville became kind of a haven for them because the world outside was not very kind to people with leprosy, but inside Carville was this extraordinary world.
So we got to talk about one more woman of Carville.
Okay.
Joey Guerrera.
Oh, right. So Joey Guerrera, this was a, and James is right. There are so many astounding, wonderful characters and people who went through Carville. And these were people who really had been dealt a pretty bad hand. And they made the most of it. And they became real fighters. And Joey Guerrera, talk about fighters.
Wow.
She was a Filipina. And during World War II, she developed leprosy. And she actually became a spy for the Allies because the Japanese who occupied the Philippines at the time, they were very terrified of this disease, leprosy. So she exploited that. Because she had leprosy, they let her go wherever she wanted to. And she basically mapped out where all of the Japanese weapons were, where the troops were moving, and then snuck it out to the Allies. And she became a war hero. And after the war, she was sent to a not very nice leprosarium in the Philippines. Right. And the Americans who were at Carville, who knew about her, advocated to get her brought to the United States so she could become a patient or be treated at the Carville.
In 1948, she got the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
She did. She got she was one of the few, if not the only, foreigners to get it.
Get President Truman. As I understand it, that pre-war Manila was gorgeous. It's a colonial, and of course the Japanese, being who they were, they destroyed her. But she was she was like a socialite. It was like New Orleans. She was like a Betty Martin of Manila. I've been trying to get this movie made so you can help me. Like y'all looking for strong female characters, people of different ethnic backgrounds. I got one that'll tear the hide off of you. And I'm going to keep trying, I promise.
Right. Isidore Dyer, who was partly Jewish, right? Or is he? Yep, his grandson is here. And he was the doctor, he was a dermatologist here in New Orleans and in the late 1800s. And he's the one, he really believed that bringing these patients together in one place, that they could be cared for, that you could treat them and basically protect them from the outside world, which is not, as I say, very nice to people with leprosy. So he's the one who came up with the idea, basically said we should create this leprosarium. And he led it, but he actually quit the Louisiana leper home. They had a board of control, and he quit it after a few years because he thought the state had basically abandoned all these patients. And that's what essentially happened, right? A problem was identified. This is leprosy. We need to deal with this disease. This is in the late 1800s. Sent him out to this place, godforsaken place, 80 miles away, and basically everybody forgot about them. They're out of sight, out of mind. We don't care about them. And Dyer quit because he said that they were not supporting the institution, and that's the only people who were making it run were the nuns. But Stanley Stein, another really an amazing American. So he was a young man when he was brought to Carville. He was diagnosed with leprosy. He was a pharmacist in Texas, and sort of like Betty Martin, he just had a very small symptom, just like a rash. Mm-hmm. It wasn't even anything really terrible, and was diagnosed with leprosy and was told he had to go to Carville. And when he went there, he just couldn't believe the place. He felt like the patients had kind of accepted their fate, and they weren't advocating for themselves. They had kind of just said, okay, this is it, this is my life. But he was really ambitious. He was bright, he was talented. So he decided first that he would have a lot of, they did have plays and social life there, so he was a lot behind that. But the big thing he did was he wanted to start a newspaper, a patient newspaper, and it was called The Star. And initially, the paper was just, a little in-house rag where they just talked about, who came to visit who, what was on the menu for dinner. Right. But slowly but surely, it started to get an edge, and the patients started writing more articles questioning their treatment by the government. Why are we here? Because they were basically imprisoned. I mean, they could not leave. If you ran away, in fact, if you came back, you were sentenced to like 30 days in the Carville jail. I mean, these are people who were sick. I mean, they were being basically imprisoned because of, at this time when Stanley first came. But the patients realized they could tell it was not that contagious a disease. Nobody who worked at Carville ever contracted the disease, or I guess maybe there were one or two cases. But so the patients started questioning, why are we here? Why is our government, why did they rip us away from our families? Why did they take away our rights and our identity and make us come here? We're not a threat to society. There are many more dangerous diseases out there. I mean, TB, there were lots of diseases out there where people were not sent away for life. And Stanley was the one who really led the crusade. And that newspaper, The Star, started getting circulation not only among the patients, but it started getting circulation among the doctors in the public health service. And then the American Legion, the local Louisiana American Legion, adopted Carville kind of as a cause. And they started spreading that newspaper around the country. I mean, it had a circulation that many local newspapers these days would envy, like 80,000.
My dad was a postmaster. We had like 50,000, and they would come through there. Darrell Broussard was the postmaster. Carville was the only third-class post office in the United States that had a branch.
Right, and so once a month you had to roll up all those papers and mail them out,
and they had to put them they'd sterilize them before they went out, and the stamps kept falling off. I mean, it was nobody from Carville was at all. That was the biggest industry in town. You know, I'd see these guys in downtown Baton Rouge. I'd wave at them. People go, "God damn, get out of the way! I think I hurt you." Hey, you know, I think Johnny Harmon. You know. We're going to get to the hole in the fence, but I want to get one more thing up. So if you're a health administrator and you run a Tulane hospital, you got some power, but if you tell the head of dermatology something, he says, I ain't going to do that. Right? Remember, there are 6 uniformed services in the United States. This is very important to remember. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and the Public Health Service. So the medical officer in charge was a little bit like a Navy captain on a ship.
Right.
You did what you were told. And so take us through a little bit of because a lot of the controversies surrounding Carville are embodied by different medical officers in charge, and they had a very large range, as you can imagine, in terms of their humanity, their competence. And let's just start with Dr. Faget forward, if we can.
Okay.
You want to start early?
Or maybe even start a little bit earlier, if you don't mind. Because so the Public Health Service took over in 1921, and so some of the initial chief medical officers, they recognized that they had to let patients there because this became their home, right? This is not just, they weren't just in the hospital for a week or a month. They might spend decades there. So that if they didn't make this a place where they could have a relatively full life, they would leave, they would run away. And so some of the early ones were, I think, very good at saying, okay, you can have a newspaper, you can have dances, you can have sporting teams, we'll have dances. And some of the other things that they did was they were doing lots of research at Carville. There was a hospital, a lab there, and I look at Carville as sort of a contradiction. It was a prison, but it was also a haven, and it was also, as a haven, an incubator, because there were all these people there that were kind of imprisoned, right? Yeah. There was a huge incentive to try and find a cure, and the doctors there worked very hard to find a cure and testing it. And so the chief medical officer, this was, some of the main things that they did. And Guy Faget, who James just mentioned, was the chief medical officer in the early 1940s. And he came there, and his expertise was tuberculosis. He didn't really know that much about leprosy, or what we today call Hansen's disease. But there was a drug that was being used at the time, tested on TB patients, and there's a relationship between the two diseases. It didn't work for TB patients, but Faget said, well, let's try it on some of the patients at Carville, who were, as most as I could tell, were pretty willing to try anything because they were so desperate to find a cure. So they tried these new, they were called, it was called Promin. They were sulfone drugs, like a form of antibiotics. And lo and behold, it started to work. And this was in the 1940s. And it didn't work immediately for everybody. It didn't work for everybody. Sometimes it took a bit of time. But this is what's known as the Carville Cure. They basically found what today is the beginning of the cure for leprosy.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. Yeah, it's that Faget, Mignon Faget, and Guy Faget's son was Max Faget, who was probably the most prominent early NASA scientist there was. He won he was a brilliant engineer.
I didn't even know that.
Yes. Did Sister Hillary take these?
Yes. Yeah. So Sister Hillary, besides taking James' photo, Actually,
I'm
what she
proud
really
to be along with these
Yeah,
people.
yes. She took photos of the patients, and they would use these photos to try and assess how different medical treatments were working. So this patient, this first photo, was taken, I believe, in 1940, before this woman received any of this new medication, the Promans. This was a photo of her in 1943, 1945, and you can see, it wasn't like a rapid improvement, but there she is in 1947. I mean, is that extraordinary? And that's why it was called the Carville miracle. So what happened is the patients, okay, we have a treatment. There's really no reason we need to be here. Why can't we just be treated by doctors around the country? We're not a threat. This disease is not that contagious. But there was still the stigma, and there was still a fear of this disease, that somehow people with leprosy were, repulsive, and they shouldn't be allowed to mix with the rest of society. And so it was really until about 1960 that if you were diagnosed with leprosy in the United States, anywhere in the United States, you might get sent to Carville and maybe confined there for the rest of your life.
Well, they had a softball team. We played them. David, I think you and I went there and played. They didn't have no road games. They never went on the road.
Right.
But so they were in a league, and they got to play all home games. And they were pretty good.
Yeah. Oh, they won the championship 1 year. Yes,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
No,
it was the only team in America that didn't play any road games.
And when it first came, it was a interracial team.
Yeah.
I mean, it had, at a time when sports in America were not, they were very segregated.
We were integrated in the 1950s.
Right. It was very integrated. They had, because the patients at Carville basically came from everywhere. So you had this incredible cross-section of Americans. You had black patients, white patients. You had a lot of people from Asian backgrounds, Hispanics. You had old people. You had kids. You had little kids who were at Carville. You had people who were highly educated and very accomplished. You had people who were illiterate. It was sort of an extraordinary community, and I feel like it was the combination of all these people that kind of gave them their strength.
I think the history of Carville can be compressed into one feature of its architecture, and that is the hole in the fence. Let's talk about the hole in the fence.
So the hole in the fence was very famous there, and it wasn't really a hole. So the place was surrounded by a very tall chain link fence, and for quite a long time, barbed wire around the top, because the patients weren't supposed to leave. Well, I mean, these patients were human beings, right? And some of them, a lot of them were pretty healthy, right? And they were not going to stay there if they didn't want to. So some people had lifted up part of the fence. There was kind of a little thing, and it became known as the hole in the fence. And patients would sneak out all the time. Sometimes they would sneak out forever. They would run away, and they're saying, I'm not staying here. Other times, they would leave to as I say, people would get married, fall in love, and want to get married, and they'd sneak out and get married. A lot of young people, they would sneak out for the night to go to Baton Rouge, to go to some bar. There was a bar down the street called the Red...
They would go to my daddy's store. By the way, the Red Rooster.
Right.
So that Neil White, that's the guy, he did an excellent book, but he had a slanderous lie against my daddy. He claimed that my daddy overcharged the patients, and my daddy never overcharged anybody. He died with more people earning money than the other human beings.
So the hole in the fence was kind of interesting because the doctors knew, especially later on, they knew it was there, and the sisters knew it was there, and they knew the patients were sneaking out. But as long as they returned, they were okay with that. And it was part of this idea that you had to kind of let people live.
When Dr. Troutman came, they told him about the hole in the fence. He said, make it bigger.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that part. All of this story, and I hope it comes through in the book, is a lot about human resilience. In the face of this disease, in the face of a society, and also a belief by some doctors, too, that this was a contagious disease,
right.
that these people responded, figured out how to respond and make a life for themselves, and to fight, eventually to fight for their freedom and rights.
So the word leper is to them is the equivalent of the N-word.
Right.
Right?
Oh, totally.
They were watching a World Series one time, and the umpire made a bad call, and the announcer said, "Well, he's going to be like the L word," and they just quit watching. Leprosy is fine. That's fine. Hansen's is more refined, but this is I've had people do it, and I've kind of said, I know you don't mean anybody, all right, but don't ever use that word, because they react very. And just before we go, because there's one more thing. If the Bible is the inerrant word of God, why couldn't they translate the disease? Why did people with this disease get stuck with any kind of disfigurement that people had?
Right. Yeah. It was, that we now believe that what was described as leprosy in the Bible was not leprosy at all, because all of the symptoms, the things that they talk about in the Bible, are not anything related to it. And it just was, when it was translated from the Hebrew to the Greek to the English, it was just the word became leprosy, and a lot of the stigma that people have related to the disease, it was due to the Bible.
The place is architecturally literally drop dead gorgeous. And the National Guard has done a really good job. And if you go there, like I take my Tulane students, I taught Tulane for 9 years, and we do a road trip and bring back wine and cheese and shit and like sit there, and they were just marveled that something like this exists. I mean, that house the nuns live in, that's a...
Well, I just put up, this is what the plantation...
That exists in rural South Louisiana.
So that's what it looks like today, basically. When the patients first came, that's what it looked like. I mean, we are talking, they were really just kind of throwing these patients away like garbage. They couldn't live there, so they ended up living in what had been the slave quarters in the back in these little cabins. And actually the sisters, the Daughters of Charity, didn't even come for another year or two. And when they came, it was, a little bit better, but it slowly but surely got better. It was really tough.
Well, the weather here is really nice. You just take a day trip, but you bring a little picnic basket.
I do want to talk a little bit about my husband's grandfather, only because that's the reason that I got interested and wrote this book. Thank you. So in 1998, my father-in-law, my husband's father, just called us out of the clear blue and said, I have something I need to tell you. I've been keeping something a secret for more than 60 years. And he was 78 years old at the time, and the secret was that when he was a young boy, the public health service or health officials had come to their home in New York and taken his father away and brought him to some hospital in the South, and he never saw or spoke to his father again. He knew that he had leprosy, but his mother said, don't ever tell anybody that your father had leprosy, because it will destroy the family, because the stigma is great. So my father-in-law kept this a secret for more than 60 years. And so we're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this. And that's when we started looking into it, and I discovered that this institution existed. And we came down to Carville in 1998, and some of the patients were still there. And that's when I realized that this happened to hundreds, if not thousands, of families where people were ripped apart from their families. And it had a devastating effect on my father-in-law. And it made me want to question, why did, in the name of public health, did our government do this? And as I say, I think it's an extraordinary story, and in some ways, I think there's some lessons to learn, for today, when we're dealing with COVID. But it was, I couldn't believe it when we went down there. What an amazing story.
They did the Tuskegee syphilis in the name of public health, and the government has done some pretty wretched things in the name of public health.
And part of it, I think, is, we don't know. A lot of people at the time didn't know that leprosy wasn't that contagious. One thing I did not mention, and which I was astounded to find out when I first started this book, is that 95% of the human race basically is immune to the disease. I mean, this is not a dangerous disease. I mean, it certainly is a serious disease if somebody contracts it, but 95% cannot contract it. And then for the other people, you don't just get it like COVID, potentially, but it takes usually long-term sustained contact. And it was all this information that the public didn't have.
As I understand it, some of the medical advances in Carville, in particular Dr. Brand and people like that, different surgeries, are still relevant today.
Right.
And I mean, it was there's some very competent, talking about Dr. Fessler, but there were some really competent people.
There were amazing people. I mean, Dr. Brand, there was a doctor there, Dr. Paul Brand, and his wife, Dr. Margaret Brand, who were at, who came to Carville in the 60s. Yeah. But Dr. Brand was one of the first people to recognize that, so a lot of patients did not, where we have this myth of people with leprosy losing their limbs, falling off. Often it was because they couldn't feel, they had numbness in their hands and their extremities. And because they damaged them, they might be cooking and just burn them and they wouldn't even feel it. They might cut themselves and not feel it. And that's how a lot of people lost limbs as a result of it. And he was the first one to recognize that it was this numbness that was it was the lack of pain that was the biggest danger to these patients, and that if you could address that and compensate for that, that you could help keep these people from getting permanent disabilities because of this disease.
Were people just allowed to live out their lives and pass away, or did the government finally say, that's it, let's pull the plug? I mean, what?
Well, the government did want them all to leave at one point, especially around, I think it was more around the 1980s. The recognition that we can treat these people, it was pretty expensive, quite frankly, to run this huge facility.
I was told, the patients asked me, Clinton was president, I got like the top guy at HHS. And said, look, James, we could treat these people at the Mayo Clinic for what it costs, and there's no reason to colonize people. I was telling Pam, back in the 90s, I went to the doctor's physical or something, and he said, James, you got something on your back. I don't think it's anything, but I want you to go downstairs and see Fuchs. So this guy, the dermatologist, comes in, and he's kind of arrogant, Look at you. He said, what's your story here, dude? I said, well, Dr. Newman said I had something on my back. He didn't think it was anything, but he wanted you to take a look at it. And he said, well, Michael's never wrong, but I'll look at it. So he lifts my shirt up. He says, it's nothing. I can take it off if you want to, but there's no medical reason. So he's walking out, and he looks at my chart. He said, Carville. I said, yeah, you son of a bitch. Now you know who you're dealing with, And he looks at me, he says, do you ever hear of a place called Carville, Louisiana?
Really?
I said, yeah, I grew up there. He said, oh, I do all the Hanson's patients in the Washington, D.C. area. So if you have Hanson's and you're in Washington, D.C., you don't colonize you.
You go to a doctor.
You go to a doctor and you get treated. But people that were there, and you've been there all your life, it's all of a sudden they said, okay, you go out and they don't want to do what the world they're dealing with. And so the deal we made is you could stay.
So the federal government basically said, we can even give you a one-time payment. If you leave, we'll give you a one-time payment, leave, or you can stay if you want to. You can stay as long as you can basically take care of yourself. That you don't need, you would get medical treatment, but you're basically not totally dependent and infirm. And several dozen patients decided they were elderly. They had spent decades there. This was their community. This was their family. They had a protest when the government wanted to throw them out, and they said, you took us away from our one family. Don't take us away from another. And, they had a pretty good life there, especially when they could come and go as they pleased. I mean, quite frankly, the federal government was taking care of all their needs. They didn't have to pay for medical care. And as James said, it's a beautiful place.
They were scared of the outside.
And some of them had never had jobs that they couldn't make a living. Their families, some of them, their families had abandoned them. They didn't really have other families. This was their community. So I can really see why a lot of people a lot of people stayed. So
My
Pam.
my
father, yeah.
dad had a insurance salesman try to sell him some insurance, some health insurance, and he said, "I don't need health insurance." He said, "The government takes care of me." My dad had emphysema, and he would go through those inhalers that which are like $50 a piece. He must have had 6 of them in his room, or he just kind of puffed on them and took care of that. But James mentioned something about how growing up at Carville, and how you got to know so many of the patients. And like Nan Grace, where she would knit sweaters with her fingers that were like this. But my dad always said his life was so much fuller because because he lived at Carville. He got to meet people from all over the world. There was the Chinese house, there's the Filipino house, there was all these international people, Mardi Gras, all those things that were going on that he would have never had. He wanted to be a civil engineer, but fate took its course, and he became a photographer and photographed so many things at Carville, an artist, a cartoonist, everything.
I know this is my book, so it looks like I'm just self-promoting, but I do think there are
a hell of a book.
extraordinary stories. So even if you don't read mine, you read another book, Anne's book, or one of their.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Well,
I've read them all.
Read them all. Read them
No,
all.
I've read them all.
These
Okay.
people were really. These are extraordinary Americans, and it would make a great movie, right, James?
I just can't believe I can't get the movie made about Joey Guerrero. Okay, the story is just so. I had this rich Philippine, wealthy, uber wealthy Manhattan woman. I thought I had her, and when you don't return your phone calls, you lost it. But I Netflix, maybe I'm gonna try that. But everybody's dying to make a movie about, heroines of different backgrounds, everything. And let me give you, Joey Guerrero. You're gonna be better than that story. And what you were saying, if I would have grown up in White Castle, which is right across the river from Carville, I'd have had the same parents, the same genes, the same everything, I would have never been James Carville. Never. I just would have had a different life experience. Carville's literally, I used to say, we got to pipe sunshine in there. We're so far in the sticks. But there was just one, gorgeous, place. And you point out in the book, I was told that Carville, Louisiana had more MDs per capita than Rochester, Minnesota. All right? I mean, think about it.
Right.
And all these people from all over the world would come study here, or they did innovative things. There were patients with, some of them were just, Johnny was a talented photographer, could draw, could do, they would all just, Betty wrote a best-selling book, 2 best-selling New York Times authors from Carville, Betty Martin and James Carville.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to end the program. Thank you very much. And special thanks to James Carville for joining us today on
Thank
such
you,
short
Doctor.
notice.